Welcome, everyone, to our next session with Dr. Todd Wood. Dr. Wood earned his PhD in biochemistry from the University of Virginia. He served at Clemson University and also on the faculty at Bryan College. He's now president of Core Academy of Sciences, and I hope he'll say some about that sometime in his presentation. So, Todd, I'm turning it over to you.
It is a pleasure to be here. And when I tell you that this is the latest, greatest version of this talk, I mean it. I'm literally just now reading some papers that I have included in these slides while Marcus was talking. So, yeah, so you're going to get the freshest version of this I can possibly give. So there you go. All right, so ape men and Adam. What do we do with creatures like this here shown in this image? In the 19th century, the picture was different, of course. This is a guy named Dendy writing in 1869 in the Journal of Anthropological Society of London. He says it is strange, if transmutation be a fact, that is, if evolution is true, that during the whole historic period, not the slightest approximation to the missing link has ever been noted. So he finds it odd that, you know, there's no connecting link between humans and apes. There's chimpanzees and gorillas, which the 19th century scientists were familiar with. And then there's humanity, and there's very little in between. There's nothing in between. Today, things are quite different, right? So scientists have been working for, well, since Dendy wrote, 150 years now. And there's a lot more fossils that have been found that have purported to be these missing links, right? They are regularly presenting us with evidence. These scientists are regularly presenting us with evidence that says, hey, we found these connections between humans and animals, just like evolution tells us should have existed. And you look at these skulls, you look at these skeletons, and sure enough, you do find Homo sapiens is a rather peculiar critter. We stand out in a crowd, let's put it that way. There are many of these fossils that seem to mix characteristics that we would today find in apes and in humans exclusively. So that's really interesting. And then, of course, the evolutionist takes them one step further and says, look, if you evaluate the characteristics of these creatures and you ask your computer to give you an evolutionary tree, you will get an evolutionary tree. You will get a tree that sort of lines everybody up here by their relationships, right? And over here on the left, where we have Homo sapiens and Neanderthals and Heidelbergensis, this is the most human side of the tree. And then down here on the bottom right, where you have things like Sahelanthropus or Ardipithecus or Australopithecus anamensis, these are creatures that are very unlike human and much more in common with the living apes. And so this all seems like some sort of slam dunk, right? If you're thinking, well, is there evidence for evolution? This surely looks pretty good, I guess. So the question then is that it? Should we just pack up our bags and go home and say, well, the evolutionists won this one and creationists will just have to find another job to do? I don't know. There's plenty of common responses to this evidence. Obviously, there is the science is right and the Bible is bogus crowd, like Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett. There's the crowd that says, well, the Bible is metaphorical. it's talking a different language about human origins. And science actually gives us the mechanistic details. It gives us, in some sense, the reality of what happened in a language that's different from the way the Bible describes it. That's more like the biologos crowd, the sort of theistic evolution crowd. Then you've got people who just humbug the whole thing and say this is all just made up stuff. These people are defrauding us. They're faking it. You have others who say now it's easy to tell the difference between humans and apes. And then, of course, you have the crowd who just insists that the missing link is, in fact, still missing. I do want to pause here for a moment and let you know I am in my office due to some bizarre set of circumstances. And there's a train about to go by, and it's going to be loud. All right, that wasn't too bad. Okay, so we'll go on. If it goes by again, I'll apologize and just, we'll just pause a second and let it get its horn blaring out of the way, and we'll go on from there. All right, so yeah, the missing link is still missing. So you look at the Bible, and what do you read? It's pretty clear in Genesis chapter 1 that God created man in his own image, and he created them male and female, and he created them in the image of God, right? So if we as creationists are to try to understand the fossil record, I think one of the first things that we have to do is ask the very simple question, well, how do we test for the image of God? Sounds like a simple question, right? But unfortunately, of course, there is no test, right? You can't put the image of God in your test tube and, run some sort of assay or analysis and try to figure out if that is in fact the image of God or not. And of course, there is a long-standing discussion in theology on exactly what the image of God actually is. Is it a quality that we possess? Is it a position that we occupy? Is it both? We'll comment on that here in a second. And of course, that's going to leave us with the question of how is it that we can find the image of God in a dead body, especially one that's pretty well along in decomposition and maybe quite fragmentary in its skeletal preservation. When you look at the actual word for image in Genesis 1, you find this set of Hebrew characters here that tells us that the word image in Hebrew is Salem. And what's interesting about Salem is you look throughout the Old Testament, you'll actually find it repeated in a couple of passages where it's clearly not talking about humans, it's clearly talking about idols, right? So Numbers 33:52, where God commands the Israelites to drive out all the inhabitants of the land and destroy all their molten Salem. So destroy their images. In 2 Chronicles 23, then all the people went to the house of Baal and broke it down and broke his altars and his Salem, his images. So that's a really interesting thing. It's not always the word used for image, right? When God says in the Ten Commandments to not make a graven image, it's not the word he uses there. But it's used often enough that it sort of raises my eyebrow, makes me think, is there something I'm supposed to understand about images and idols? There's a connection there, right? Image as an idol. An idol, if you sort of stop and think about it, they're physical manifestations of unseen gods or distant rulers, right? They indicate that a god or ruler rules a certain place, like a temple, right? And when you build a temple in the ancient Near East, you put a Salem in it. You put the image of your god in there. Now here's a Salem from that I took a picture of in the Harvard Museum. This was originally found. The original version of this was found in a village called Samal, which is maybe 2 hours north of Aleppo, Syria. It's actually crossing the border into Turkey there. And this is an image of Esarhaddon, who is an Assyrian ruler. He is mentioned in the Bible. And Esarhaddon here is saying, I am all powerful, I am gigantic, I am the chosen one of Assur, the god of the Assyrians, right? And in the bottom right corner, I love this image that one of those guys cowering down in front of him, tiny little people pleading for mercy. That's Pharaoh down there. So Esarhaddon here is using this image that's not in Nineveh where he lives, right? Where he has his palace and has his throne. He's set up this image in this village of Samal to remind everybody there, hey, you know, I'm the boss here. I'm in charge, right? When we think about humans as the image of God, I think it cannot be a coincidence that God chooses that word to convey what we are, right? So we, in some sense, indicate to the rest of creation that God rules here. We are his physical representations. And I think it's really interesting because it strikes me that it becomes another reason our physical manifestation of God's presence here gives another reason, besides just false worship, that we should not make other images of God, right? We should not make images to worship God with, because we are the image of God, right? Now, if we are to occupy the position of the image of God, we need certain, let's call them mental and spiritual qualities, right? In the ancient Near East, right, that image of Esarhaddon there, that was made of a probably a rock called basalt. It's black and tall and hard, and basalt is pretty abundant in that area of Syria. There's a lot of lava flows in that area, and so there's nothing particularly special about having a rock that is basalt, right? So what makes that an image is the way the basalt is organized and the way the basalt is carved and the way the basalt depicts the image, the picture of Esarhaddon, right? And so for us to be the image of God, it's not simply that we're humans, right? It's that we have certain attributes that God has given us that make us stand out from the rest of creation, that allow us, in some sense, to exercise God's power here as the people who have dominion over creation. So the corollary of this then is that the sorts of attributes that we would think are associated with the image of God, well, Homo sapiens, modern humans with our tall foreheads and our chins and our big brains, we're not the only ones in the fossil record to exhibit these capacities. So that raises the question of, well, are other Homo forms actually human? These things that paleontologists call Neanderthals or Erectus or all these other guys, could they be human? And to really understand this, I wanted to think more carefully about this notion that humans exercise dominion, right? We are not like most animals who find themselves largely victims of their environment. We have the ability to shape and change our environment and modify our circumstances so that we can rise above it, so that we can survive. Now, that's not equally true of everyone, right? So your modern developed nation dweller, citizen of Europe or citizen of the United States or Canada or Japan or Australia, we have many advantages that many other people in the developing world do not have, right? And so obviously there's not the same degree of dominion that we exercise. Still, there are pretty clear behaviors, I think, that tell us that even the simplest tribes, unreached people groups in the Amazon basin, for example, have the image of God. They possess the image of God. They are the image of God. And they have the sorts of attributes that would allow them with time and training and whatever, to become the same sort of dominant individuals that we Europeans or we modern developed humans think of ourselves as. So I don't want us to come into this thinking that somehow, oh, those people are so primitive. It's not quite that. It's more that, my goodness, these individuals are significantly more advanced than any animal that I can imagine. Even the most advanced chimpanzee or gorilla does not behave in any way similar to even the simplest, technologically simplest member of Homo sapiens or the human family. I think there are 6 traits that we can identify in the fossil record that can help us to recognize the kinds of things, the kinds of behaviors, the kinds of capacities that would allow people, allow the possessors or the demonstrators of these abilities to dominate their environment and thereby have dominion over the realm of creation and thereby exhibit the image of God. And these 6 traits, you can see them right here: controlled use of fire. There's no animals that are able to control fire and use it for heat and light and cooking. So when we find evidence of controlled fire use, that would be good evidence that we have a human being there. Sophisticated tools, I put sophisticated in quote marks there. It's not clear to me exactly where the cutoff is. There are some tools, stone tools, for example, that are very, very simple and that we have actually observed a number of different non-human species making in the modern world. And that includes some chimpanzees. They are capable of cracking rocks together and taking sharp flakes and using them for other things, for cutting, for example. So there's a certain level at which, banging rocks together is really simple. And yet when I'm, taking a stone tool and I'm shaping it carefully into the, sort of the arrowhead form that we're familiar with from our modern Native Americans, then you've crossed a line from being just, a chimpanzee banging rocks together to being someone who has a pattern in his head and is carefully shaping the rock in order to make it fit that pattern that's in his mind. And there's clearly careful planning and careful execution of all of that. All right, so sophisticated stone tools. Art or decoration. There's a number of places where we find artifacts that appear to have been modified for gratuitous purposes, let's put it that way. Things that have been done just because we like it. Uses of pigments, for example, the modification of teeth or shells in order to turn them into baubles that you might wear around your neck, for example, as decoration. That sort of thing. And of course, cave art as well. The 4th one then is the care for wounded or elderly. Here we might place evidence of extreme injury in some hominins' skeletons, where you can see that it's not just been an injury, but they have recovered from it and they have continued to live a life in some way. There's a couple of those in the fossil record that really make you sort of wonder, how did this guy even survive this? He must have had help from people who helped to keep him alive, just make him survive from his injuries. The 5th then is intentional burial. This again is not a thing that you see among animals at all. There is among chimpanzees and bonobos, for example, some kind of care for the bodies of the dead. And elephants, another species that recognizes the bones of the dead. They're the elephants that they had known. But the idea that you would, place a body in a grave and cover it up and put grave goods in with it, that's all very human sorts of behavior. So if we see evidence of that, that would be something that make me think, yeah, this is probably human. And then I have a sort of catch-all at the end here, complex dispersal or exploration. This would include things like, we find evidence of these guys deep in caves where it's dark and they must have had some sort of light in order to explore that deeply. Maybe we find evidence of them on remote islands where they must have crossed open ocean to get there, something like that. And that again, it's going to be a little tricky to interpret some of those. But in general, though, what we would like to see are multiple evidences, right? You don't want to just say, well, controlled use of fire, that must be human. It could be that that's human, but you would really like to have some security knowing, well, this particular form of skeleton is associated frequently with sophisticated stone tools, evidence of hearths in the sediments, evidence of decoration, and so forth. And then you sort of become more and more confident that what you're looking at is something human and not something that's animal. I thought we'd run through a couple of examples tonight. I'm going to go through 4 specifically here: Neanderthals, Erectus floresiensis, and Naledi. Now, Dr. Ross has already introduced us briefly to most of these guys. So we're going to fill in this chart as we go. And then we're going to talk about what do we do with the rest. So in terms of Neanderthals, then, we have well-attested evidence of fire across the range of Neanderthals. Everywhere you find these sorts of stone tools here, these Mousterian tools, you often find evidences of hearths as well. And hearths, pretty recognizable in sediments. You're digging down, and suddenly you find this sort of blackish, sooty-looking circular thing that's very thin, or possibly thick, but it's quite circular. Those are obviously old campfires, right? You don't really need to think too hard about what you're looking at there, though. That's soot, and that's the campfire. So those sorts of structures are associated with these types of tools. And you can see, looking at this stone tool from France here, that hand axe is beautiful. That hand axe is beautifully symmetrical, clearly, carefully crafted by the Neanderthal that made it to be just that perfect teardrop shape. And the edge is quite sharp, and they use it for their cutting purposes. It's all quite impressive. And more recently, then, we've gotten multiple reports of processing of chemicals, birch tar, to be quite specific, to turn it into a glue. So this residue has been found on a number of different elements that we infer to then mean that Neanderthals were making composite tools as well. They were mounting their stone tools onto wooden shafts to make spears, to make really deadly spears. Possibly, I don't want to go arrows, but it's possible that they were using them on smaller shafts as well. So yeah, so Neanderthals are making quite sophisticated stone tools. In terms of art, we have widespread evidence of Neanderthal art as well, including lots of evidence of use of ochre among Neanderthals for coloring purposes. In Southern Europe, we have shells that have been drilled through, and you look at the hole there, and you can see the drill marks, and you can see wear marks from where something's been threaded through the hole, right, and worn down the hole. So apparently it's dangling on something. We have evidence in multiple sites of eagle talons that have been carefully cut off from a dead eagle and then strung up on another one of these threaded things. Not sure what they are. We have carvings. We have cave art as well. So here's an example of a tooth from a cave in France. And you can see right along the top there, you can see that groove, right? Where apparently they cut this groove into the tooth, and then they wrapped it around with string, and that then becomes some sort of bauble that they wear. So Neanderthals liked to do things that were not entirely strictly necessary for their survival. They indulged in artistic expression. For care for the wounded or elderly goes, Shanidar 1 would be my go-to example for this. That whenever I think about, someone who has been cared for, this guy comes to mind. He he had a tough life. One part of his skeleton, you can see that he's lost a hand. Well, he's lost the whole arm. It's basically his humerus. The upper arm bone here is broken just above the elbow, and it's gone, and it's healed up, right? So his other arm is quite strong and good, like you would expect an arm bone to be, that's been used for muscular purposes, and the other one is sort of withered and small, and it doesn't have the elbow to it anymore. So he lost an arm at some point, but he survived it, right? He's also taken a blow to the head that was probably enough to cause him to go blind in one eye and deaf in one ear. And you can see in this picture of his skull here, his eyes are not symmetrical, not even close to symmetrical. Something happened there that wasn't good. And so when you consider the multiple wounds that he has suffered here, that blow to the head especially must have left him quite impaired mentally. At least a concussion, probably more. And so keeping him alive, he would not be able to hunt. It would be up to the members of his social unit, whatever that was, tribe, family, in order to keep him alive. In terms of burial, we have a number of examples of burial. La Chapelle in southern France, Shanidar Z. This is another Neanderthal from the Shanidar cave in northern Iraq. Shanidar Z was found with a rock under his head, nicely laid out with a rock under his head, which surely looks like they were thinking of that as a pillow. Kabara 2, shown here on the right, that's a beautiful, beautiful Neanderthal skeleton that is exquisitely preserved. It was the first Neanderthal skeleton where we found a hyoid bone being that little loose bone in your neck that your tongue attaches to. Not something, it's very small and not something easily preserved, but here it is pristinely preserved. You can even see the beautiful posture of the Neanderthal, his arms crossed across his chest. What's missing that the researchers think cannot be a coincidence is his cranium. Given the exquisite preservation of the rest of the skeleton, the researchers commented here that it's not likely that the skull just got lost or deteriorated. It's much more likely that someone dug it up and took it away. Which then again makes me think, yeah, somebody remembered that guy was there and they came back and got the skull for whatever reason. I don't know what, but that clearly suggests a burial. And then for dispersal, I can point to the weird formations here at Bruniquel Cave in France, where Neanderthals apparently went deep into this cave, hours into the dark zone of the cave, excuse me, and broke down a bunch of speleothems, stalactites and stalagmites, that's it, and then piled them in these weird circles for reasons we don't know. There's evidence of burning in there as well, so they were burning stuff, whatever they were doing, but they weren't living there. There's no evidence of food residue or anything like that. They were just making these weird, and the fire evidence, I should say, is also quite small in extent. So they weren't making campfires. They weren't making fires for heat and food cooking. They were making just tiny fires, maybe for light. What this was, we don't know. Pretty peculiar, but it definitely suggests these guys were going deep into caves. And the discovery of Neanderthal stone tools on a number of the Aegean islands of Greece there's a lot of debate about, how much of that would be connected to the mainland, if there was different sea levels during the glacial periods and so forth. But at least some of them, it seems, would indicate actual seafaring of Neanderthals. They were able to cross open water somehow. So for me, Neanderthals, they tick all the boxes, right? And I have no doubt in my mind Neanderthals are as human as I am, even though they look a little different. I won't hold that against them. Now, Homo erectus, that's a different story. In terms of fire use, this one's a bit tricky. There's plenty of evidence of burning associated with Homo erectus remains. But the evidence of actual hearths and fire, like a campfire, that's a little more rare, and it's not directly associated with erectus remains. So we'll talk a little bit about Gesher Bennett Yaakov tomorrow. It is a site in northern Israel, north of the Sea of Galilee, where abundant, remarkable evidence of very ancient hominin use has been found. And we'll talk about that a little bit more then, but that is a place where people think, the conventional radiometric date says this is probably in the era of Homo erectus, definitely outside the era of Neanderthals. So this is likely to be evidence of fire use for erectus, even though we don't have any actual physical remains of erectus from the site. Tools include Acheulean hand axes. Here's one from Olagasele in Kenya. And you can see again, it's not quite as finely crafted as the Mousterian tool of the Neanderthals, but it definitely indicates, shaping on both sides. They're sometimes called bifaces because they're shaped on both sides. And they're shaped to create edges on both sides as well, right? So you've got actually 4 different sides being shaped all at the same time to create this roughly teardrop shaped. I just get the sense that Acheulean axes are more opportunistically practical. Neanderthals took more time to craft theirs into particular shapes that were aesthetically pleasing, and erectus was in a hurry and just needed something to cut up the latest kill. At least that's how I read it. As far as art goes, we do have one carved shell from a known Homo erectus site in Indonesia. It sure looks to me, I don't know how else you interpret this, like a Neanderthal was doodling on the shell. Just little scratch marks that are parallel. I'm sorry, not a Neanderthal, Homo erectus. Homo erectus was doodling on the shell. But that's really as much as we have of art evidence from Homo erectus. So that's a little more uncertain. Care for the wounded or elderly, I couldn't think of one, and I couldn't find one that was really unequivocally an example of that. Intentional burial, definitely uncertain as well. Most of the Homo erectus remains we found have been quite fragmentary and not arranged in clear burials. And then dispersal of erectus. Well, erectus is the first one found dispersed globally, so that's important. Then again, globally, of course, means Asia, Europe, and Africa, which of course are all connected by land, and you can get across them by walking. We don't have Homo erectus in the New World. So yeah, that's maybe not the best evidence of dispersal, but we do have evidence of stone tools at an island called Socotra. Socotra is quite distant, even at glacial maximum. The island would be still tens of kilometers away from the nearest mainland. It's off the coast, the Horn of Africa. It's under control of the country of Yemen right now, even though it's geographically closer to Somalia. And the stone tools are really interesting. They haven't been dated, so we don't know how old they are. They haven't really been excavated very much. It's mostly been surface surveys. And we know that they are associated with locations that make sense. They're associated with little, runoff streams and so forth. And so you can imagine whoever made them would want to live in that location. And they appear to be relatively abundant that you can actually find them pretty readily. So that's really intriguing. Oldowan tools could very well have been made by Homo erectus. And some of the tools appear to be quite complicated as well. So that's a really intriguing thing that suggests that Homo erectus had pretty significant seafaring ability. So I would say, for Homo erectus, controlled use of fire is indirect, but I can't think of another way to explain Gesher Bennett Yakov. So I'm going to say it's a good indirect. It's a green indirect, right? Tools, definitely. Art or decoration, maybe, that shell is pretty interesting, I admit, but not much else, right? Not much confirmatory evidence. We don't know much about the care for the wounded or elderly or the burial. And again, another green maybe for complex dispersal, if they did indeed leave those tools on Socotra. Parisiensis is an interesting one. Initially, when it was described back in the early, in 2004 and 2005, it was described as being associated with both fire evidence and stone tools. More recent analysis has shown, in fact, that the fire evidence is not associated directly with the sorts of tools that we think Homo floresiensis made. So the fire we sort of have to check off as being unlikely, tools likely. We don't know anything about the art associated with these individuals. Care for the wounded or elderly, we don't know. Intentional burial, we don't know. And dispersal, well, they're found on this island of Flores, which is in Indonesia. It's separated from, and it has always been separated, even at glacial maximum, from mainland Southeast Asia. So if you imagine the ancestors of these guys coming across Asia and moving down into Southeast Asia, eventually they're going to have to cross that channel to get to Flores. There's no other way to do it. It's at least 10 miles wide, quite treacherous seas, so it's not a place where you could just accidentally cross. Yeah, so it's an interesting conundrum, and it does certainly suggest that Floresiensis got onto the island of Flores because it wanted to, and it intentionally dispersed there. So I would judge it with two evidences there that I think are pretty good. The tools I think are quite likely associated and made by Homo floresiensis, and the complex dispersal I would say definitely. And so I would say that the evidence there for Homo floresiensis being human is not as good as say Homo erectus, definitely not as good as Neanderthals, but still, that's pretty good. I'm actually, optimistic about Homo floresiensis being human. Now, recently you might have seen headlines like this: mysterious species buried their dead and carved symbols 100,000 years before humans. This is on CNN, most reliable of the news outlets. Maybe not. Yeah, so always be skeptical of what you read in the popular press. And here, these are referring to Homo naledi. And over the past 6 months, we've gotten a number of, past 7 months, we've gotten a number of pretty amazing announcements regarding these peculiar individuals found in a cave in South Africa. And first announcement was that the cave where they're found is full of evidence of hearths and fire and burning. So that would suggest that they were capable of using and manipulating fire, which is pretty good. Most recently, these headlines came out, and along with them came 2 reports that are currently unpublished that describe scratch marks, carvings that they think were made by Homo naledi and two, let's call them body placements that they think are in fact graves, where there's evidence that there was a disturbance in the sediment and a body was placed into that disturbance and then covered over with sediment. And I think that evidence is actually kind of interesting. The evidence for the carving, they offer no evidence that conclusively links that artwork to Homo naledi at all. So that one, I'm not sure. And the fire evidence hasn't even been published yet. And I'm not sure what the delay there is, other than slow editing process. Well, I judge Homo naledi, yes, complex dispersal. How did they get down into that cave and make use of it so much to leave behind bodies of their dead? But the rest of the evidences that have been advertised for it are big maybes and big red maybes. And I say red maybes because I just don't. Maybe, maybe not. It could go either way, right? And it's going to depend on the quality of evidence. And this is a story that's still developing, and we're going to just have to wait for a while as more data come to light and we're able to actually look at the information that's out there. So, yeah, Homo naledi in my book right now. Yes, I think human, but could be not. I don't know. Now, the rest of these guys, we just don't know anything, right? Homo habilis is so fragmentary, we don't really have enough of anything. Where it's not even clear which fossils in East Africa belong to this guy named Homo habilis, or if there really should be or is a guy named Homo habilis. Sediba, only known from one site in South Africa. Don't know any of these things there. Don't find any of those things there. And then other australopiths like Afarensis or Australopithecus africanus, we don't know of any evidence there. So what should we conclude from that? They are not human? Well, that would be nice, except it is possible to imagine people who just don't have any of those evidences associated with them in burial, right? It's not impossible that there was some small tribe somewhere that just didn't leave behind any cultural evidence, but left behind skeletal evidence from some sort of landslide or something like that. So, yeah, the absence of evidence actually isn't very conclusive. The old adage goes, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. If you don't find the evidence, you got to look some other way. You got to come up with some other means of doing it. What do we do there? Well, what I've been doing the past 20 years, past 13 years on hominins and 10 years before that on other animals and plants, is trying to come up with ways to capitalize on the information that evolutionists use to create their evolutionary trees. So here's a nice, this very pretty, very interesting evolutionary tree. Looks all really quite impressive. You've got all of these guys lined up, the more apish guys on the right, the more human guys on the left, and it looks all very impressive. But what if there were other ways of analyzing this, right? And the tricky bit here is that you cannot use evolutionary tree methods to tell you whether these things belong on the same tree, right? Because an evolutionary tree method is only going to give you the best tree. It'll never say, hey, this doesn't belong here, because that's not an option, right? So these programs are going to give you a tree whether you want it or not. So you got to come up with something else. And the procedure that I've pursued then is called cluster analysis. So this is an example of how I've reanalyzed these data. Here I've gotten, let's see, Australopithecus in green, Homo is in yellow, something called Paranthropus in red. And here I've got Homo in red and Australopithecus in green and Paranthropus in this light blue color. You can see there's what I've done here is to take the character-based information that was used to make the tree and just calculated distances between the different taxa on the tree, basically asking, well, how different are they, right? Instead of just saying what characters do they have in common, which is almost the only thing those other methods are looking at, I'm asking, well, how many characters do they have in common? right? Not what characters they have in common, but how many of them are there compared to the whole thing. And what you find is pretty clear gap here between Paranthropus and the other taxa. Because this is in 2D, you can't really see, there's a pretty good gap between the green guys and the red guys as well. Pretty good gap between Homo and non-Homo. This was published, goodness, 2010. And you can see here, this little chart is intended to show you, based on that information that was published, you can use many different clustering techniques. You can use different parameters for your clustering techniques, different distance metrics, different sets of characteristics based on those original characters, and you always get the same clustering. That's what the colors are showing you. The numbers are the different cluster groups, which are arbitrary. The numbering is arbitrary, and then the colors. Then I've colored things. Blue is sort of the thing that includes Homo sapiens, and then green is the one that includes Homo sapiens, which is presumptively the human group, and then blue is the one that contains the non-humans, like Australopithecus afarensis, Lucy, or the Paranthropus taxa. Now, there's more data and more taxa that have been found since then, including our friends Homo naledi and Homo floresiensis. And here is an update that was published last year. And here we're showing sort of a distribution of the taxa again, according to their dissimilarity. You can sort of see there's a gap between the red and the green. Sort of good, yeah. The clustering shows quite a lot of agreement, but not as much as it used to, right? There's still a lot of blue that's consistent across the board, right? Chimpanzee, gorilla, and Ardipithecus are never in any other group than the non-human group. Across the bottom, there's this huge range of putatively human taxa that are always grouping together. But you also see some variety. You see Africanus, for example, shows up twice out of all of these different things as part of the human group, which is weird. The quality of that clustering is actually pretty low, so I wouldn't really put much stock in that. What's really interesting is floresiensis, where you have a number of times here shown on the right there where floresiensis consistently clusters with the non-human taxa, which is really odd. And I'm still trying to wrap my brain around exactly what that means. I'm not sure. Floresiensis seems to be skeletally quite unusual. And you've got at least one, well, not one, 4 examples here where you've got the humans split into 2 different groups. But for the most part, you have quite a good consistency across the board. There's a couple of questions here and there. And I should also mention, when you split humans into 2 groups, that produces a much, much poorer quality clustering than when you don't. So, yeah, I'm very encouraged by these results. You might not think, you might want a little more consistency, and I certainly would like more consistency myself. But as far as these sorts of things go, this is really good. This is really exciting. It confirms what we had previously with fewer taxa and fewer characteristics. And it's really quite what I would expect, that there is a difference between non-human and human. There's a difference between ape and human, and there is not transitional forms between them. This work has been published in the Answers Research Journal. And you can read that for free. Oh, I guess that was published 2 years ago. I don't know what year it is. Anyway, you can read that for free. Check that out, where we talk about, this is our latest hominin analysis. We will have a number of new analyses to present at the International Conference on Creationism, basically 1 month away, 1 month from now in Cedarville. So hopefully you'll be able to check that out as well. I'm sure those papers will be made available as soon as possible. What does all this mean then? Well, what I would say it means, when you look at the evidence of culture and the evidence from the cluster analysis, I would say that humankind most certainly consists of Homo sapiens, modern living people, Neanderthals, and this Homo erectus, Homo ergaster group. Ergaster is just another name for some specimens of erectus from Africa. This also, interestingly enough, is exactly the group of hominins that Marvin Lubenow wrote about in his book, Bones of Contention. I remember I was a student when I first acquired a copy of Lubenow's book and read it, and was just deeply impressed and deeply moved by what I read. Very excited to learn more about hominin fossils. And here I am late in my career coming back to that early passion. And very excited to see how much the evidence still lines up with what Dr. Lubenow said 30 years ago, 40 years ago. No, 30 years ago. Math is hard. Anyway, so I actually call this, I've actually decided we're going to give these guys a name. Sapiens, Neanderthal, and Erectus. That's the classic Lubenow humans. And I call them the Lubenow core, right? And the others are the ones that creationists tend to disagree about. And it makes sense because they're new, right? And we don't have a lot of information on some of them. And some of them are just really fragmentary, right? And you don't get a lot of agreement among conventional anthropologists on what they should be. Those, I tend to think, they're human as well. But if I'm wrong, life goes on. I can live with that. So am I sure about some of these guys? No. I feel confident in my work and my clustering. I have done, I think, due diligence on that side of my research. But I recognize that the evidence is quite fragmentary and susceptible to change in the future as new things come to light. And that may cause us all to modify our opinions about what these creatures might have been. That's life, right? Now, what about the skeleton? So everything that I've shown you from my cluster analysis tonight was done based on craniodental characters of the skull and characters of the teeth. And you might be wondering, well, what about the rest of the body, right? And in fact, Dr. Lubenow's book, he emphasized the form of the body as being one of the things that can tell you whether something is human or not human. So this is a pretty severe deficiency. And I'm happy to say, for the past 3 years, I've been working with a student quite diligently on rectifying this problem. And we do have a paper coming out at the ICC next month that will present our results. And I'll give you just a very simple sneak preview. I'm quite happy with the results. So you're wondering, is it earth-shattering and does it change everything? Not really. There's some uncertainty that it brings into some taxa, but not really. It's pretty consistent with what we've already found. You might be wondering, well, what does this mean for all that radiometric dating? Why is these fossil people tell me that this fossil is 2 million years old and that fossil is 500,000 years old and so forth? That's a question that's part archaeology, which I'm quite interested in, and part physics, right? Because you have to deal with all the sorts of methods that are used to date these remains. And so that's beyond my expertise. I'm starting to dabble in archaeology, which I'll talk about tomorrow afternoon, and show you some of the results that I've gotten from the Holy Land, which I'm quite interested in, and I'm quite interested in developing as well. But generally speaking, I'm going to have to leave questions of dating to people more qualified to comment on them than I. So in general, then, my model is very simple. You have Adam and Eve and eventually Noah and Mrs. Noah. And from that original stock of humanity, all of the forms of humanity that we have in the fossil record and the living world have sprung. They're not transitional forms. They're not evolutionary intermediates. If you look at the characteristics of these things with methods other than evolutionary tree building programs, you actually find pretty good consistency telling you what is human and what is not. Again, some of these might turn out to be wrong. That's okay. We might find some new things that we have to add. That's fine too. As we learn more and we become more confident in our understanding of the archaeological and paleontological record, then obviously some of our opinions about things are going to change. That's just how science works. And that's not anything to be alarmed at. So if you're looking at this tree and thinking, I don't like that guy, cool, I don't care. It doesn't matter. It's if one or two of these guys or three of these guys turn out to be not on the tree, whoopsie, it's no big deal. And we're going to learn that as we learn more about them, right? As we become more familiar with the evidence surrounding them, and we'll just move on from there. Now, other lingering questions that I haven't addressed. What about the human genome? Lots of really interesting stuff from genomics, and there are lots of creationists who are actually working on human genomics, and I haven't really integrated that into this presentation, but because I only have an hour and I didn't have time. So yeah, the human genome is a really important thing that needs to be addressed and needs to be integrated in with the rest of this in the future. What about archaeology then? I'm going to answer that kind of tomorrow. I'm starting to dabble in archaeology primarily in the Holy Land because I think that's a really great place to try to understand the relationships of fossil hominins to Homo sapiens, because there you have pretty clear biblical connections where you can connect the stratigraphic and archaeological record there to what it actually describes in scripture, which I think is tremendously important if we're going to start to unpack how archaeology interfaces with anthropology and humans that don't look like us. And of course, what about the next big fossil discovery? Good question. I know at least two that have been not exactly announced, but sort of revealed in the world of social media that have not been scientifically described in any way. They just said, we found these bones and here's what they look like. But they didn't actually, clean them up or, write up papers about them. So there's new things coming. And I'm hoping there's going to be new things from some of the taxa that we already know about, so that we're able to learn more about them and be more confident in our understanding of what they are. Now, for more information, you can visit us at coresci.org/connect, where you can learn more about the Ministry of Core Academy of Science. We are a group of individuals who are interested in nurturing the next generation of faithful Christ-like creation researchers to explore the hardest problems in creation. We do this through a number of activities. We have an annual retreat. We have a number of public events that are designed to sort of kind of recruitment events, get people involved in creation science. We have the Sanders Scholarship Fund, whereby we provide funding to assist students who are working with faculty mentors on creation research projects to try to help them get more experience as creation researchers so that they can, take over one day when I'm ready to retire. So that's our ministry at Core Academy. We also have our podcast, Let's Talk Creation, which you can find wherever you get your excellent podcast. Now, if you're really, really interested in what we're doing, I do have a Patreon called Research Reports. I dump there my research notes, which includes notes on things I'm reading, notes about projects that I'm working on. If you're a part of Patreon over the past year and a half that I've been doing it, you have had a front row seat to my work on all of my ICC papers, which I'm sure has been quite a journey, because it has been quite a journey getting them all done. but that is available. I think it's $4 a month. It's something cheap. So if you're really interested in what I'm doing, that's the place to go, and you'll learn more about exactly what's happening in the world of Dr. Wood's research. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to entertain your questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Wood. This is very interesting. Couple questions, and then there's also some posted by our participants. So if you have a question, feel free to chime in the Q&A. First question, on an early slide, you mentioned, is it easy or not to tell the difference between hominids, human beings, and apes? So do you think, are there any morphological markers of humanity versus other kinds?
No, I think humanity is a suite of characteristics, some of which might be missing in one or two individuals. So it's not a necessary and sufficient condition where you have certain morphological characters that must appear in all humans. I think it's more that there are a suite of possible characteristics that identify what humanity is, and that, enough of those characteristics make you sufficient to be human. It's kind of like the old sort of essentialist way of thinking about things, but it is not based on isolated characters. It's based on large number of characters.
Right. Good. Oh, and by the way, thank you for giving a shout out to Dr. Marvin Lubenow.
Yeah.
And yeah, you know what he thought about habilis, right?
Oh yes, I know what he thought
That
about
guy out.
And I am digging into that right now. I am looking at it's a beautiful era we live in where you can get these 3D scans of these fossils on the internet.
Yeah.
And so you can start doing your own research right in your own home. And I am digging into habilis right now because I'm really interested to find out, is this really a thing? And I've been using habilis for years based on what evolutionists tell me. This is what habilis is. Well, okay, I'm going to find out now. Is that really true or not?
Next question. Is fraud a possibility with some of these finds? And the questioner actually mentioned habilis.
I doubt it. I mean, these fossils are now they've been around long enough that most of them are available for inspection by any old qualified scientist. So if there had been fraud of those sorts of things like habilis, I think that would have been discovered. And it certainly would have been a pretty sensational thing to describe, right? And there have been mistakes that have been rectified, right? So it was found, for example, that one of the vertebrae associated that was attributed to the Lucy skeleton, there was a very fragmentary cervical vertebrae that's in all the pictures. Turns out it's a baboon bone. Whoops. And then there was a really interesting paper on the rib cage of Neriacotomy boy, which is the classic Homo erectus skeleton. It turns out when the researchers went back to that skeleton to look at it again, because they were doing rib research, they found a bag of loose parts that had never been included in the reconstruction. And they were able to actually reconstruct the ribs better. So they made a much better rib cage for Neriacotomy boy than the original researchers had, because they just weren't that dedicated to rib research, which frankly, I don't blame them. Ribs are very confusing and complicated, but there it is. So yeah, there's enough people going back and redoing some of this stuff that you would find out. It would be apparent. And with the new stuff coming out, there's so many collaborators working together on it. It would be really hard to imagine a fraud of that scale. Somebody in that group of hundreds of researchers examining those fossils, somebody's going to squeal. And some of those fossils I've actually seen myself. I've seen Naledi and I've seen Sediba bones when they came to America at the Perot Museum in Dallas. And I looked at them really closely, and they're real as far as I can tell. So yeah, I doubt we're dealing with any real fraud anymore. That's more of a thing of the 19th century. It's possible, I suppose, someone might try to pull a fast one, but I think it's going to be discovered pretty quick if that happens.
Good. Next question. Would you consider yourself a lumper or splitter in paleontology? And as an aside, would you define the terms?
A lumper, I mean, this is usually something that's associated with limiting species. So a lumper would say species are really variable, so we're going to include a lot of things in the species, in a single species. And a splitter is going to say, oh, no. This population here is clearly markedly different from this population over here, even though the differences may be indecipherable, right? So one of the things I've been sort of peripherally involved with in my career is plethodonid salamanders. There's an abundance of plethodonid salamanders here in the Southeast United States. It's the single most diverse location for the salamander family. And there's been this trend over the past 30 years, I guess, of taking these widely distributed species and sort of dividing them up into little species that you can literally not tell apart just by looking at them. You have to get out measurements and calipers and all this sort of thing. That's a splitter. So, am I a lumper or a splitter? Yes. I can look, for example, at Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, and I can say, my goodness, there's a lot of differences between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. I don't think in the grand context of hominins that they matter at all, but they're there, right? This bone in your thumb, this terminal bone on the end of your thumb, that's called the terminal or the distal phalanx. In Neanderthals, it's always the same length as the bone right beneath it. But in Homo sapiens, our terminal phalanx there is always shorter than the bone just beneath it. What does that mean? No idea. No clue. But that's one of the weird differences between us and Neanderthals. So, I look at that and I go, okay, there's a reasonable case there to be made that they're different species. But I don't care. That's mostly where I've come down here in my old age. Call it George, call it Fred, call it a different species. I just don't care. What I am interested in is whether they're human or not, right? They may be very different humans from me, but that's not really the relevant question. The question is whether they're human. So when I look at a Neanderthal and I see, they're making fire and they're boiling birch tar to make glue and they're twisting twine. I forgot to mention that one. They're fishing. They're gathering clams. They're cooking food. They're decorating their clothes. They're human. They're human. I don't care what they are. They're human. So, yeah, I'm a nunner. Not splitter, not lumper. It doesn't matter to me.
Good. Perhaps the final question: are all human fossils post-flood?
Yes. So Marcus mentioned that in the previous talk. I totally agree. I'm going to give some more reasons why I think that's true tomorrow in my afternoon presentation when I talk about the Holy Land and the archaeology there. So yeah, I think it's pretty clear that they're all post-flood. Neanderthals, a slam dunk as a post-flood thing, and the others as well. So I'm fairly confident that they're all post-flood.
Good. Another question. If you've also read the book Contested Bones, can you compare and contrast to Bones of Contention?
Can I compare Contested Bones to Bones of Contention?
Yeah.
I can try. It's been a while since I read both of them. They're pretty similar. I mean, again, the Lubenow core lands as human in all of those books. It's one of those things that creationists very nearly across the board, young Earth creationists agree that the Lubenow core Erectus, Neanderthal, and Sapiens are all human. I'd say it's hard to compare, the more interesting recent stuff because Lubenow doesn't cover it in his book because it's, old. And I think there's like one or two differences. I think they land differently on a couple of fossils than I do, but for me, that's just a matter of, more data is going to come out and one of us is going to be wrong or both of us are going to be wrong. And I don't care. I'd much rather know what the reality is, whether it's friendly to my position or not. Bring it on.
Very good. Dr. Wood, we're pushing up against our time here, so I thank you very much for joining us. Participants, we are going to begin again tomorrow morning, Saturday morning at 9 a.m. You can find the complete schedule on our website. Dr. Heck, you're going to kick things off tomorrow morning for about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll get back to our presentations there. So I thank you so much for joining us. I pray that you had a good connection and there was lots of excellent information. I know more than we could process, even with our supercomputer brains at the time. So these are being recorded and they will be available to you, and we'll talk more about that next time. So until we meet again tomorrow morning, thanks for joining us. Have a great evening.